For decades, the relationship between Canada and the United States was held up as a model of economic partnership. Few borders in the world saw such constant, frictionless trade. Auto parts, aluminum, forestry products, dairy. Every day, billions of dollars in goods moved north and south as if the border hardly existed at all. To many, it felt like the perfect marriage of two economies. But today, that once unshakable bond is under pressure. President Donald Trump's new wave of tariffs and threats has turned this relationship into a source of deep uncertainty. One day, he promises heavy taxes on steel, aluminum, and agriculture. The next day, he suggests oil could be his next target. The result is a cloud of unpredictability hanging over Canada's largest trading partner. And this leads to the million-dollar question: if America keeps squeezing, will Canada start looking elsewhere? Could the country that has always sent nearly all of its oil, metals, and goods to the U.S. really pivot to China or the European Union instead? A few years ago, that might have sounded impossible. But now, with new infrastructure projects like the Trans Mountain Pipeline and growing frustration in Ottawa, it no longer feels so far-fetched. This is where the story begins. A partnership at a crossroads, and a decision that could reshape not only Canada's future, but the global balance of trade. President Trump has never been shy about using tariffs as a weapon. To him, they're not just taxes on imports. They're leverage, a way to pressure other countries into making concessions. Canada, despite being America's closest ally and largest supplier of energy, has not been spared. The targets are clear steel, aluminum, agriculture, and most importantly, oil. Each of these sectors is critical to Canada's economy. Oil alone accounts for about 4 million barrels exported to the U.S. every single day, making America by far Canada's biggest customer. In normal times, this dependence would be considered a strength, a guaranteed market right next door. But when tariffs enter the picture, that reliance turns into a vulnerability. For Canadian producers, even the threat of tariffs is enough to cause panic. If U.S. refiners suddenly face higher costs on Canadian crude, they could start sourcing elsewhere, leaving Canada scrambling. And for industries like aluminum or dairy, the U.S. market is so deeply embedded into their supply chains that losing access would feel like having the ground pulled out from under them. Trump knows this. His unpredictability, announcing tariffs one day, delaying them the next, keeps markets and governments on edge. It's a strategy designed to extract maximum pressure, but at the same time it raises a serious risk push Canada too far, and it might decide to break away from this one-sided dependence. And that's where the story turns. Because for the first time in decades, Canada actually has an exit ramp. A pipeline that doesn't just flow south, but west, opening the door to Asia. For decades, Canada's oil industry had one reality: almost everything went south. About 90% of its crude exports flowed straight to the United States, feeding American refineries that were built to handle Canada's heavy crude. It was efficient, profitable, and geographically convenient. Canada didn't really have another option. The Pacific coast was too limited, and building new pipelines was politically messy. That picture is now changing. The expansion of the Trans Mountain Pipeline has given Canada something it never truly had before: direct access to the Pacific Ocean. For the first time, tankers can leave the port of Vancouver filled with Canadian crude and head not just to the U.S., but to global markets, and they are already doing so. Recent data from the China Institute shows that half of all oil exports through Vancouver are now going directly to China. This is a major shift. A few years ago, the idea that Canada could seriously sell large volumes of oil to Asia seemed like a fantasy. The U.S. was too big, too close, and too dominant to replace. But with new infrastructure, the economics begin to change. Chinese and Japanese refineries are hungry for crude. They don't carry the same political baggage as Washington, and in a world of rising energy demand, they are eager to lock in long-term supply. This puts Canada at a true strategic crossroads. It no longer has to accept America as its only outlet. It now has a card to play, a pipeline that could reroute part of its economy toward Asia, and with it, change the entire balance of North American trade. This is not the first time Canada has wrestled with the question of dependence on the United States. In fact, half a century ago, Canadian policymakers debated what was known as the third option. The idea was simple but bold: diversify away from the U.S. and build deeper ties with Europe and Asia. Back then, the proposal didn't gain much traction. The US was too convenient, too close, and too lucrative to ignore. But now, with Trump's tariffs and threats shaking the foundation of the relationship, the third option is back on the table in a very real way. China, with its massive appetite for energy, is the most obvious alternative. Already it is Canada's second-largest trading partner, and its refineries are eager to process heavy crude. For Beijing, securing oil from Canada also means reducing reliance on the Middle East, a strategic win. For Canada, it means selling to a customer who won't suddenly slap tariffs on energy as a political bargaining chip. Europe is also in the conversation. Thanks to the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, tariffs between Canada and the European Union are already close to zero. Yes, geography makes the EU harder to reach than the US, but in an age of global shipping, that barrier is not insurmountable. The revival of this debate shows how much things have shifted. What was once dismissed as wishful thinking now feels like a necessity. The third option is no longer about if Canada should diversify, but how quickly it can build the infrastructure and partnerships to do it. And this is where the stakes rise, because if Canada truly pivots toward Asia and Europe, the consequences will be felt far beyond North America. It could trigger a reshaping of global energy markets. Tariffs don't exist in isolation. They create ripple effects that move through the entire global economy. And this is where Trump's strategy could backfire on the United States itself. Consider oil. U.S. refineries are designed to process heavy crude, the kind Canada produces in large quantities. If tariffs raise the cost of Canadian oil, those refineries can't just switch overnight to lighter grades from elsewhere. They'd be forced to pay more, making their refined products less competitive in global markets. That hurts not just the refineries, but also American consumers who would feel higher costs at the pump. Meanwhile, China is waiting in the wings. If Canadian oil becomes more expensive for the U.S., Chinese buyers will gladly take it at better terms. They can refine it at home and even resell finished products on the world market. In effect, America's loss becomes China's gain, a shift in energy power that no U.S. president would ever want to hand over voluntarily. And it's not just oil. Metals like aluminum and steel, if redirected, could also strengthen China's industrial position. Europe, too, could benefit by locking in long-term supply deals that were once reserved almost exclusively for America. In trade, doors rarely stay closed for long. If one buyer makes things difficult, another buyer steps in. That's the nature of global markets. By trying to protect U.S. industries on paper, Trump risks opening opportunities for America's rivals and giving Canada new reasons to walk away from its old dependence. This growing possibility is fueling anger and defiance inside Canada, where leaders and citizens alike are starting to see tariffs not just as an economic challenge, but as an attack on their national dignity. In Canada, Trump's tariff threats are not just seen as numbers on a trade balance sheet. They are being taken personally. For many Canadians, it feels like an attack on decades of partnership and goodwill. Politicians in Ottawa have been quick to frame it that way, warning that the country will not be treated as a submissive junior partner. The public mood is shifting as well. Small protests have erupted, and in some cases, frustration has even spilled into cultural arenas, with crowds booing the American national anthem at sporting events. These gestures may seem symbolic, but they reveal a deeper sentiment. Canadians are tired of being strong-armed. This anger is fueling political momentum behind new energy projects. Pipelines that once seemed dead, like Energy East or Northern Gateway, are being discussed again, this time framed as a matter of national survival. The argument goes, if Washington wants to use oil as a bargaining chip, we'll build new routes to Asia and Europe, even if it means fighting environmental and indigenous opposition. It's not just about economics anymore. It's about sovereignty, the sense that Canada must take control of its own future, even if the road is costly or difficult. For many, Trump's actions have awakened a determination to reduce dependence on the United States, no matter how inconvenient. And yet, this determination collides with reality, because breaking free from America's orbit is much easier to talk about than to achieve. Breaking free from America's economic orbit sounds bold and empowering, but the reality is far more complicated. Canada may want to diversify, yet geography, infrastructure, and global markets still pull it back toward the United States. Shipping oil across the Pacific is expensive. Tankers from Vancouver can reach Asia, but the costs per barrel are higher than simply piping crude south into American refineries. On top of that, environmental groups and indigenous communities continue to resist new pipelines, making large-scale expansion politically and legally difficult. Projects like Energy East and Northern Gateway face years of opposition before they could ever move forward. The global economy itself adds another layer of risk. Oil demand is volatile, prices swing wildly, and clean energy is rising as a competitor. Betting heavily on new Asian or European customers is not a guaranteed win, especially if global demand slows. At the same time, the cost of doing nothing is also high. Relying almost entirely on an unpredictable White House leaves Canada exposed. Each new tariff threat is like a reminder of how little control Ottawa has when 90% of its oil flows in one direction. That vulnerability gives the U.S. leverage, but every attempt to exploit it also pushes Canada further toward alternatives. This is the paradox Canada faces. Staying tied to the U.S. is safe but suffocating, while breaking away is liberating but risky. Either way, the dynamic between the two countries is changing, and the old certainty of seamless trade no longer exists. So, where does this leave us? Canada and the United States, once the closest of trade partners, now find themselves standing at a crossroads. On one side is tradition, a partnership that has fueled both economies for decades, built on proximity, trust, and efficiency. On the other side is uncertainty, the possibility that Canada could redirect a significant share of its oil and resources toward China or Europe, rewriting the rules of North American trade. Trump's tariffs are the spark behind this moment. If he moves forward, Canada may respond by signing new oil deals with Beijing or Brussels. That would give China a stronger hand in global energy markets and weaken the very U.S. industries tariffs were meant to protect. If instead both sides find a compromise, the partnership could endure, but with scars, and with Canada less willing to accept America's dominance without question. The consequences reach far beyond Ottawa and Washington. Energy prices, global supply chains, and even European and Asian refineries could all be reshaped by how this standoff unfolds. In trade, every action creates a chain reaction, and this one involves some of the world's largest economies. So the big question remains, can Canada truly pivot away from the United States, or will geography and shared history keep them bound together despite the tensions? Will Trump's tariffs protect American industry, or will they end up driving away the very ally that supplies half of America's crude oil? Only time will tell. But one thing is clear. The flames of this trade dispute could burn both countries, and the outcome will shape not only the future of North American energy, but the global balance of trade itself. And now, I'd like to hear from you. Do you think Canada can realistically shift its oil exports toward China or the European Union? Or will the pull of the U.S. market always be too strong? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications because this energy chess game is far from over.